are at their homes, while there are 3 or 4 in Chambers and Invercargill. That is because of the importance of one of the items on the agenda today, which is Three Waters, and we need to be together to make sure that we have all the information out to our councillors and to the public in general. So we'll just go through the formalities of the meeting. I understand there are no apologies, however, I just need to confirm that. There don't appear to be any apologies. Leave of absence, as you're aware, I applied for leave of absence for this week some time ago, but due to COVID, I've had to stop the trip away, which is unfortunate, but that's how it goes. But are there any leave of absence going forward? Don't appear to be. Any conflict of interest in regards to any matters on this agenda?
Yes, Mayor Gary, I've got one in relation to the Curio Bay item.
Curio Bay. Noted. Thank you. There is no public forum and there are no extraordinary or urgent items. And we have the confirmation of council minutes held on the 24th of August. For these, I will move that they're true and correct. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Fraser. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, the first item on the agenda today is item 7.1, the Three Waters reform. And I'd just like to highlight that there have been many personal views expressed over social media and misinformation distributed by government through false advertising of the actual situation here in New Zealand. What is known is that this country cannot continue to operate potable water plants, including rural water schemes that supply potable water, and treated wastewater plants, including stormwater, without a consistent approach. The status quo is not an option. That has been supported by local government, New Zealand, and central government. Environmental and cultural considerations must be at the forefront of any future developments. And to that end, government have indicated some years ago, just over 4, that change is necessary, hence the setting up of Taumata Arawai, the regulator, which is in force now. And then there's the work that's going on over the Three Waters proposal. Just to remind everyone, we are here to discuss where we are at as a council. This is not a day for any decisions on council's view. We are here to provide feedback because at this stage we do not have all the information in our hands. And I just want to pass over now to Mr. Russell to just talk us through the considerable amount of paperwork that we've had in front of us on this report and the considerable amount of information that's been received over recent months in regards to the proposal put in front of us by central government. Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, councillors. Look, before I get started, I just wanted to take the opportunity to welcome and acknowledge Dan Bonifant from Morrison Lowe, who will be assisting me with presentation of this report and facilitating a discussion as part of the work that Dan and the Morrison Lowe crew have been providing to both the Otago and Southland Three Waters collaboration and more recently directly to Southland District Council.
Sorry, Matt, just before you go on, could I just ask Councillor Duffy, Douglas, Harper and anyone else that's not muted to mute themselves, please? Sorry.
I've just tried to mute myself and I've gone off the whole thing, Gary. I'm having a bit of an issue, but I'm working on it.
Just your microphone, Paul, if you can. Thank you. Sorry, Matt, it's all yours.
Thank you, Your Worship. Okay, so this report seeks to consolidate a significant amount of information and work in relation to both central government's Three Waters reform proposal, along with current and potential future service delivery arrangements. This work has been undertaken over many months, involving extensive engagement with a number of stakeholders including neighbouring territorial authorities, the Department of Internal Affairs, Mana Whenua, local government, New Zealand, and many other key sector partners. Some of the critical information consolidated as part of this report includes detail on central government's proposed reforms, specific Three Waters data and modelling produced to date on the local, regional, cross-regional and national Three Waters service delivery context. This includes work produced both locally and regionally, driven through the Otago and Southland collaboration, as well as information produced by the Water Industry Commission for Scotland on behalf of the Department of Internal Affairs. Also included is analysis and key considerations associated with alternative delivery models that has previously been presented and discussed by Council. In early August, central government, following feedback from the local government sector, proposed an 8-week pause on the reform program to provide territorial authorities an opportunity to gather their thoughts and relevant information, share this with their communities, and consider the implications of the proposed reforms on their communities and organisations, and further both provide feedback and seek clarification on any elements of the proposed reforms. Given this, in addition to presenting the significant information and analysis in the attached report, as part of Council receiving the report, Dan and I are seeking to facilitate a workshop discussion to identify specific feedback that Council wishes to convey to and/or request from central government. Resolution L in the report allows for this context to be populated. Best case, we're able to compile and finalise that today. More realistically, this may involve a follow-up meeting to finalise following some finessing. So before we delve into the workshop discussion, a couple of things. As Mayor Gary has already articulated, I think it's important to note, other than feedback to central government, Council are not being asked to make any decision or take a position on the reforms at this point. It is anticipated that following the receipt of feedback from the sector at the end of September, central government will revisit the reform timeline and next steps, and then communicate this with the sector on this basis. Secondly, I wondered if before I hand over to Dan and we delve into a short presentation and a workshop discussion, Council might like the opportunity to ask any questions they may have in relation to the report and the attachments.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Are there any questions, Councillor Byers?
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Thank you, Your Worship. You're asking for feedback from this council. You've noted that there's been an awful amount of information that's been provided, and none of it which is particularly accurate, given that we have a whole lot of assumptions that have had to be made. You're asking for consistency and a consistent approach. And this is LGNZ, I think, which is pushed for this consistent approach. But given that the population differentials across the country are quite significant, Southland's got small population. I don't know how we can have a consistent approach to managing human manure and waste from our households. I would have thought it would be better off, we'd be better off saying, no, we don't want to lose our infrastructure, and provide feedback to the government around how we propose to do it. And that would involve an honest conversation with our community.
So you're wanting us to go to government to say when we're not going to provide, I just missed that last bit. What was it you wanted government to consider? That we weren't going to provide?
we should be saying to the government that we want to retain ownership and control of such vital community infrastructure. Because all this report and all this time we're spending here is about providing information to the government on this proposal to take the infrastructure away.
Yep. No, I get that. Yeah, to retain ownership and control.
And
Any
so
other comments?
To retain ownership and control, Gary, we need to do things differently. But there's no consideration in this report for managing human waste in a different fashion than what we do now. We mix human manure with good water. We mix it with water that we rinse out of rinse the lettuces and vegetables in our kitchen sink. We mix it all together with bath water, shower water, and we wonder why we've got a problem. And in the case of TR now, we pump it 20 kilometres.
I've got that. Thank you, Councillor Byers. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Councillor Owen.
Thank you. I just have a question, and I couldn't pick it up through any of the information, or we may not have it. Just do we have any indication as to what the proposed new water entity, how they might structure charges at all? I'm assuming that we don't, but I just wanted to check in terms of at the moment, for example, in some smaller communities we're district funding things at the moment. So some of our smaller communities don't have the high burden if their systems are more unaffordable for their smaller population. Do we know if they are going to be taking that? Is it proposed to end up kind of like electricity, where everybody around the country has similar charges, or for this whole new water entity, everyone within that entity within our area would have the same water charges, or if they are intending on having more specific for different areas? I'm just the reason why I think that's important to understand is because it directly affects affordability for the end user if the proposal here.
That's certainly a question that's been asked, and the information that I've had back is that there's water meters have been discussed, or a charge, not a rate. LG&Z and the councils that I've heard say they don't want it to be referred to as a rate, because then inquiries would come back to councils with the word rate. So, sorry, Dan, have you got your hand up to answer this question?
Yes, Your Worship, if you like, I can add in. There is no definite answer to your question yet. The mechanism for charging is yet to be developed. And it is a charge. There is no ability for these entities to rate like a council. It is a service charge. Whether it is volumetric, or whether it's a fixed charge, or whether there's a difference between urban and rural charges, is all to be defined in the future stages if these are created. And as part of one of the connections between the councils, the customer, and these entities, every entity has to produce a pricing plan and strategy, which is one of the kind of foundation documents that sits around the side that is overseen by the regional governance group. So they may well end up having slightly different approaches, but it'll be within a statutory framework.
Thank you, Dan.
I think just to add to Dan's comments, it's really important to acknowledge that one of the key tenets of the reforms is that the cost would be shared across the entities. So one of the components of your question, Councillor Owen, I understood was whether or not the charges would be normalised across the entities. And as we understand it at this point, because there are different population sizes associated with the proposed 4 entities, the subsequent cost for the end user would differ between entities. But one of the key tenets or premises for the reforms is that by aggregating the population and sharing the cost across a larger population, you thereby reduce the ultimate cost for the end user. But to Dan's point, there are different ways of levying those charges, be it volumetric or connection based, depending on the type of use. So that's some detail that's yet to be well understood.
Thank you. Councillor Byers, Councillor Ravenclaw.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, one of the key advantages proposed for this new water scheme is that these new entities can borrow something like 800% more than what councils are able to borrow. So we know who's going to pay for that in the end, don't we?
Yep. The short answer is yes.
We can make a pretty good assumption then that it's going to cost us a lot more money.
Whichever way, exactly. Yeah. Mr. Russell's got his hand up.
Absolutely right. Councillor Byers, again, one of the key aspects of the proposed reforms is that the new entities have the capacity to access greater levels of debt than councils currently have the capacity to access. And this is again one of the critical points that central government are at pains to identify, on the basis that the regulatory reforms, which are now effectively locked in, have introduced a new framework for the management of these services, and we're required to meet those obligations. And the concern is, based on projections and modelling, that councils don't have the capacity to meet those requirements, given current debt capacity limitations.
So it's going to cost a lot more because we refuse to consider alternative ways of managing the water infrastructure.
That's matters that can be discussed further down the line, but as we've indicated, no matter what we do, it's going to cost more. Councillor Ravenclaw.
Your approach.
Sorry.
Through you, Your Worship, thank you. I just wanted to go back to what Karen was saying in the future stages going forward around rural and our small communities, and will we know the costs in the structure of this before a decision is to be made by council, or are these stages are we going to go ahead? And I know there's been a delay in what the government is saying around coming back to them by September. How much information are we going to be receiving before we make a decision?
Well, that's what I said at the start. We haven't got all the information yet. What we're here for today is not to make a decision, but to provide feedback back to central government, which we've been asked to do by the end of September. And over the last few weeks, there's certainly been a bit more information coming, but not to the extent that we are in. No council is in a position to make a decision. Hence why a number of have jumped up and down pretty high, including ourselves through the Otago Southland Forum.
So going back to that, Your Worship, have we had any reply to that letter that was sent by the mayors of Otago and Southland?
No.
So through you, Your Worship, just to add to those comments, the answer to your question, Councillor Ravenclaw, has to do with the number of queries and the amount of clarification feedback sought from the sector to central government that will determine whether or not the timeline needs to be extended significantly, or the feedback and questions are able to be responded to relatively easily. So we're not yet clear, and neither is central government, to be fair, as to what sort of feedback they're going to receive or clarification sought.
Councillor Scott.
Thanks, Your Worship. I'm just following on from some of the other discussion. Like with today, the outcome that we're trying to get to today, almost like Councillor Boy said at the start, sort of indicates that we're moving ahead with this sort of set plan. And I've had a look at it over the last few days and tried to sort of break it down to the bare basics of what we're actually trying to do here. And that's to look after our ratepayers, to make sure that when they turn on the tap, they're getting clean water, and when they flush the toilet, it goes away in a clean and safe manner. But there's so many complicated factors around that, and Councillor Owens raised some of them, and we've also got a whole lot of people that aren't currently connected and may choose not to be connected in the future. We don't know how they're going to be charged. We don't know how the charging is going to be for the current people. We've got potential volumetric stuff, but that might be easy to measure for your water coming in, but how do you measure your volumetric for your waste going out? All these sort of unknowns around it. And all I can really say is I fully support their letter that went out saying we need to pause this and focus on the regulator needs to be there. Everyone agrees with that. Have that regulator there. Give that regulator some scope to start the ball rolling with some of this, and provide some funding for councils to carry on doing what they need to do with their infrastructure. But I just think there's so many unanswered questions out there. And we can feed a whole lot back to government today around what we need to know more of, but it's so hard to support something that's still so unknown, and those assumptions that are out there, reading through them all and seeing those, you can't make any decisions based on the figures that those WICS models have presented, because they're just so far-fetched, basically. And I struggle to make a decision around a lack of clarity and a lack of detail.
Okay, so part of the feedback back to central government will be that we will struggle to even get any decision. We need to pause, and we need further clarification around what the charging regime may be for the future, as well as what that will mean for new connections. Is that stuff that you would like added in there, Councillor Scott?
Yeah, pretty much. There's just so many unknowns.
Okay, so Dan, you've got your hand up to answer that question. Sorry, Councillor Menzies, before I come to you. Yeah, you're unmuted, Dan.
Sorry, my internet dropped out. I was just going to make a couple of points, and that is, I don't think you should feel that your feedback to the government about what's important to Southland and the issues you see in the proposed model in any way needs to be seen as supporting it. I think you can say we do not support a change from current, but if you don't take the opportunity to take back issues with the proposed model, gaps in it, and how that will not represent your community's needs, then you run a very real risk of those issues not ever seeing the light of day. Because the government has moved from this being an opt-in, opt-out proposal to very clearly not saying there is going to be an opportunity to opt-in, opt-out. You know, the minister has quite clearly said in interviews last weekend, didn't say that opportunity still exists. You know, that ball is very much with them. And what I've seen over the last 8 weeks is that councils pushing issues back, like things like you do not understand the difference between rural water schemes and urban water schemes, has finally reached the government, and they are finally seeing it as a separate issue that needs to be understood and changes made. They had workshops yesterday and today to try and challenge the existing governance structure and the very, let's call it, diffuse accountability that councils have as owners through that what's proposed at the moment, to try and see if they can come up with something that still represents their desire for balance sheet separation, which, as Matt said, is critical for enabling these entities to borrow enough money to do the work that they are advised they need to do, but to provide better accountability to councils and community. And those are only taking place because of the consistent messages going back up that your proposed model does not meet the needs of our communities. So I know it's really hard to not go back with just a firm no, but I think you're going to miss a trick if you don't use this 8 weeks as an opportunity to point out the gaps in the model, and there is plenty. My job today is not to tell you that it's the best thing since sliced bread and it's going to answer all the problems, but if we don't use the opportunity to think about what we do like about what happens now, or we do like about something else, if we don't push those back, then we really miss a trick.
Thank you, Dan. And that's exactly why we're here today, is to ascertain what the feedback is that the councillors want to take back. And you did right. We just can't go up there and say no. They'll be coming back with, well, what are your solutions? And to fully appreciate the comments that have been made so far. So please keep it up. Councillor Menzies, Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think to date for many in our community, the focus has been on the transfer of our assets. But the conversation is far broader than that, and I don't know that that's occurring in our community. And so that needs to occur. And alongside that, we have local government reform occurring. And we don't have any information relating to what that might look like. And again, for many of our ratepayers, as Councillor Owens indicated, cost could be a significant issue. And we are also not aware of, because that charging structure is not clear, we're not aware of what those service charges might look like and what the future rates might be if we're operating under a different local government structure. And I don't think the two should be regarded separately, because as a ratepayer, people want to know that overall impact, particularly with these simultaneous processes going on. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to touch on the transfer of ownership, both Ngāi and councils have said that won't be occurring. Of course, we're bound by Section 133 of the Local Government Act. So, and has pointed out a couple of days ago, that could be pulled back with a stroke of a pen. But I would say to central government, good luck doing that. Councillor Scott and Councillor Byers.
Thanks, Your Worship. Councillor Menzies covered off one of the things I was going to talk about, but just I've just got a question with regards to the council levies for Te Mata Arawai. Do we even know what they're going to be charging us, or how they're going to be charging us for that regulatory side of things going forward?
I can't answer that. I don't know.
But just to, so I mean, to support what Dan was saying, articulated better than I did. Like that's kind of what I want to do from today, is to basically give the government a whole lot of questions as to how this model isn't necessarily going to fit the South and why. And we need a whole lot of answers, I think, and more than just the how's this going to work with the representation side of it, but how's this going to work full stop.
So your question is, what is the how is the regulator going to charge?
Yeah, well, it's been mentioned that there's going to be levies to councils, because Te Mata Arawai's got to get their money from somewhere, and if they're going to be regulating and overseeing, what is that model?
Thank you, Councillor Byers, and then Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, feedback for the government would be to note that this proposal forces a disconnect or a disconnection between communities and one of the issues that arises in community. And a disconnection between the people and the problems that have been created with them is not healthy. So perhaps we could, or the government would, enable or empower communities to manage water and waste themselves. For example, we've had a lot of rain recently that's fallen on roofs across the district. A lot of that water, I would assume, would have been ideal to be used in toilets or filled up water tanks. You could wash cars and so on. Just as an example of empowering community to manage the issues themselves.
Some communities do that, Councillor Byers.
Yeah, well, let's encourage more of it. We've had a lot of rainfall and we don't talk about stormwater much.
Yeah, no, we can
And-
encourage them. There's no doubt about that. But whether they pick it up or not is up to them. I
That's an
know
excuse, Gary.
Rakiora take all their water off the roof.
Well, that's good. How about the whole province? And we do need to
Matt, you
look
wanna come in?
at human manure to compost, because if you don't mix it with water, you don't have a problem.
No, get that. So
you-
just
you-
before we come
Gary.
in with Councillor Douglas and Councillor Ford, Mr. Russell's just got a comment.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, just really quickly in relation to comments from Councillor Byers, from my perspective, the proposals or the suggestions you're raising, Councillor Byers, are spot on, and my comments in relation to those in conjunction with the reforms is they're certainly not mutually exclusive. There's absolutely nothing preventing Southland District Council as a local council advocating for or looking to integrate some of those provisions into its district planning environment. However, it's an adjacent or concurrent issue rather than a substitute. And in relation to Councillor Scott's questions as to the funding mechanisms for Taumata Arowai, my understanding is that as a central government entity, it would be funded via the national tax system rather than funded via councils. So just to assist with some clarity there.
So there's a possibility that we would be embarrassed if we asked that question because we already know the answer. Is it?
Through you, Your Worship, possibly. I'm not 100% confident that there wouldn't be some sort of.
So we need to clarify.
Levy, but perhaps Dan, you might have some further context to add there, or not.
I think you're probably right, Matt. I think the thing here is that if there is any levies or charges for something that they do, it's going to fall on the water service providers, and that's whether it's council or an entity. It is going to be exactly the same. So ultimately, there's no difference really there at all for what we're talking about today. It's not going to weigh up what make the current model or a future model either better or worse.
Need to clarify it, so we'll carry on. Okay, Councillor Douglas, Councillor Ford.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Much has been made of the likely to realise if we go to the water entity model, but bearing in mind that these entities will be in effect monopolies, how can we be assured that the efficiencies promised or budgeted for will actually get realised?
Dan or
I can jump in there.
thanks, Dan.
Councillor Douglas. I've actually got a slide and a few that I can show up shortly that rather than trying to decide whether the efficiencies are what WIC say they are or they're only going to be pick a different number, we've done some sensitivity analysis that says, well, what if they can't achieve that level of efficiencies? What would that do to the costs? So that you can still see the kind of the range of possible outcomes rather than it being a specific point. So I could probably talk to that in a few minutes.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just take a question from Councillor Ford and then I think we will move along with the workshop because there may be some answers to some of the questions coming forward or it may promote other questions. So Councillor Ford and then we'll go back into the workshop information.
Yep. Thank you, Your Worship. I was just concerned that the paper we've got in front of us tells us that we are not doing it correctly. And if the rules change for the environmental rules that are being quoted to us, and the cost of that is way beyond any numbers that council are permitted to do. So really, we're being told that we aren't doing it correctly. And this new organisation will take it over. And I believe they'd have a tiger by the tail because, like we all realise, someone's got to pay for it. It's probably us. So you know, I'm concerned that they're taking a massive bid on things that we'll never be able to pay for. So that would be my major concern. And certainly, as Councillor Menzies mentioned, that we don't know where local government's going. We're likely to get skittle and total. And, you know, that's a further concern that I would have. If we don't come along with government agencies, they're just as likely to say, well, that's fine, we'll put a cross through the lot of you, and they'll do it their way. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ford. Your government is certainly saying that the status quo will not continue, hence why there is a broad brush approach to the reform, but that's our opportunity to put in our 5 cents worth as has been indicated. Right, so I think before we have any more questions, I think we'll just carry on. Mr. Russell, are you happy to proceed?
Sorry, thank you, Your Worship. At this stage, what I'm going to do is hand over to Dan, who has prepared some slides in order to just do a quick recap on where we're at, the government proposal, and transition the discussion or facilitate the discussion around what is it that we want to feed back to central government at this stage, and or what further clarification would we like, or what aspects about the reform that we are the reform proposal that we are okay with and would like to confirm. As Dan indicated earlier, the critical thing to consider at this point is not missing an opportunity to inform where things are at and state or take an opportunity to seek or provide that clarification. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. So I did just want to pick up something that Mayor Gary said at the start, and Matt's also reinforced, is that the kind of the pre-work that you guys have done over the last 8-week period. I've supported a number of councils who have been racing to try and catch up to where you are. They have not had the same understanding of the local conditions, the local network, the local issues, and even the conversation where you know, a number of you have said you understand that there is no status quo anymore, that regardless of what happens, the regulatory system and the regulatory changes means everything is going to be different. That the fact that that is understood around your council table is that puts you further forward than a lot of councils. So I should acknowledge that and congratulate you with that. These next few slides are just designed as a bit of a prompt to remind everyone of some of the key aspects of what the proposal is. And they are also an opportunity for you to ask questions. And I know Matt and I have talked to you about some of this before, but things have changed. And you've probably had other discussions, but every time you talk about these, there's other features that pop up. But there are some key things that in the proposal that we need to understand, that, you know, that while these are in public ownership, the government has said that they are intended to be publicly owned. We recognise that there's an issue across the country over the concern that may offer future opportunities for privatisation. These will own the assets. They will own all of the assets of the Three Waters systems. They will transfer, as would do all the staff that are within the system, as would all of the contracts that exist for Southland with the existing suppliers. The relationship would live between the entity and the customer. The entity would charge the customer would get its service. Council was not involved in the delivery of Three Waters services if this reform took place. These entities are governed by a board that is appointed based on competency. It is not intended, although it's not prevented, as far as I know yet, that this is not where councillors would also sit. And that one of the government's key tenets in this whole reform process has been to separate the balance sheets of the ownership of the owners of the councils from the entities. And that's where these debt levels get 600, 700, 800%. And that's where the government tells us they've been through a process to have them approved by the credit rating agencies that allow these significantly higher debt levels. But those are key fundamental aspects of what's being proposed. One of the things that the government has specifically asked for feedback on is the boundaries. So what is proposed for Southland is to be part of Entity D. You know, Entity D is not the whole South Island. It is the Ngāi Tahu Takiwa. And what we've got in front of us here is a map that shows where the boundaries of the territorial authorities in the South Island are, as well as the boundaries of the Ngāi Tahu Takiwa. So there is specific feedback sought from the government about where that boundary should align itself to. So that's one of the things we need to consider. This is probably the most confusing aspect of it, and also complicated, and also represents a huge amount of thinking that needs to be developed in order for this to be effective. But there are some important aspects here that we all need to understand. And one of which is you will be an owner under the current proposal, but it is not ownership in any concept that we currently have in New Zealand, or probably in the rest of the world. It will simply be a schedule to an act that lists the name of every council in Entity D in alphabetical order and says you are the collective owners. There is no shareholding, there is no ability for dividends to flow from these entities through to the ownership. There is no liability flowing back to the councils as owners. I've heard the DIA, Alan Prangnell himself, say a number of times to a number of councils that any contingent liability for the debt of these entities will fall on the Crown, not on the councils. So there is ownership in a sort of figurative sense rather than anything meaningful. The owners of Entity D would appoint members to the regional representative group. The regional representative group is going to be made up of 12, 50% of which is an iwi representation, and 50% comes from the councils. So there is a small number of representatives for the council group on that body. And that body has a really key role to hold the entity to account. And if you see down the side in the purple boxes, these are the key documents that would govern the entity. And that is really where the accountability to council lives, through the strategic planning documents, through the statement of intent, statement of performance and expectations. That is really your accountability mechanism, not so much your ownership interest just coming down. So there is a lot in there that needs to be developed and worked through. One of the most contentious issues is the fact that it is not the regional representative group that appoints the board to the entity, that is the responsibility of an independent selection panel. The government's position so far on that has been that is the thing that separates the balance sheet from the councils as owners from the entity, and that's absolutely essential. But that is definitely under attack, and it is definitely being questioned at the moment. Out on the right, sorry, on the left, is the regulators and the new regulatory system. And I know when we did our workshop some time ago, Matt talked to you about economic regulation and the changes that would bring, and how that's Tamata Arawai has a role over the service. The regional councils have a role over the providing the resource consents, and the economic regulator has control over effectively the prices that can be charged, the amount of money that the entities have to invest in renewals, or the amount of money that has to be invested in new capital to meet the standards, and the price at which it can pay for those. So there is intended to be quite a lot of power over on the regulatory side. The consumer body is a reasonably untested or unknown part of the puzzle, but it's recognised that there lacks a community accountability aspect that the consumer body may well provide. This might be a good place to stop. Mayor Gary, and have some questions. Matt, you might want to chip in on anything that I've left off, or yourself, Mayor Gary.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, certainly, especially around the this model here. As you say, it's created some discussion across the country, and I know that there has been some comments made through the Otago Southland Forum in regards to Entity D. Personally, I don't believe we need to discuss that, but are there any, unless there are any questions around Entity D or the ownership model? And I can't see any hands at the moment, so just start talking.
Okay. So this is the dashboard that's been made available to everybody across New Zealand. Anybody can go to the Three Waters website and type in the name of their council or any other council and find this information. It is drawn largely from the RFI process that the government put your council through late last year and early this year, and it was a massive undertaking. Took a significant amount of resource to provide the information that has fed into aspects of this. You can see the dark black circles. RFI is where information comes directly out of the RFI. The purple indicates where they have used that or other information to calculate numbers. And then up on the left is the economic analysis of the reform process. And that is effectively the number of jobs created delivering the investment forecast by the government. So it produces some pretty good numbers. Obviously, the government's focus on reform has been, as they've come out over the last couple of months, over this bit up here, the average household cost per annum. It is providing a lot of concern across the country that the numbers don't represent the actual situation in individual councils. And I'll talk to yours in a second. But just so everyone understands what we're talking about here, these are not a cost that anyone in your community currently is paying. It is the current cost is the cost of your service divided by the number of users, the connections. It is tended to provide a representative number that you can use to forecast different situations going forward. 1,640 is the number proposed by the government in 20, that the average cost to any household in Entity D would be in 2051. And that's in today's dollars. So that's forecasting that forward. The alternative number being produced is that if Southland continued to be a service provider, then in 2051, the average household cost in Southland would be $8,690 per household. Now the plus indicates that it's actually more than that. They have applied a cap so that there is no higher charge anywhere in New Zealand than $8,690. In your case, it's actually more than that. What we've tried to do is bring together all of the different information within the WICS analysis. So the WICS analysis has a number of base assumptions that are being challenged on a daily basis across the country. And I'm sure we've all seen letters or reports or correspondence either written by ourselves or by Castalia or by someone else that says that the numbers in the WICS modelling don't make sense. We have tried to provide a visual representation to the councils about, well, what might the numbers be if they're not what WICS say. So if you remember, the base case number you've been presented by the government is 8,760. Moving in from the right, what we've done is said that there are base assumptions in WICS about the number of households, the number of customers that are used. There is actual data about the number of customers used. So we've corrected for the number of customers, household customers you have, and the proportion of income that comes from those customers within Southland. So that brings the cost down. This is the 2051 number to 7,694. Moving across, there is then an assumption in the WICS modelling around the use of debt. The WICS modelling caps council debt at Three Waters debt to revenue of 250%. Now, that's not how council borrows its money. You borrow at the aggregate whole council level. So we've adjusted their model to allow for that. And what that does is it brings the household cost down again to just over $6,000. So that represents, in our view, a more realistic assessment using the WICS information and council information to recognise a cost. One of the other issues with WICS that is identified time and time again is the scale of the investment projections they use, and that they are far too significant for individual councils. And for smaller rural councils or councils with large geographic areas, the trend is for the WICS projections to be far, far bigger than what anybody might consider to be a reasonable forecast in the future. So we have said, well, what if in the case of Southland, the investment required was only 50% of what WICS have said? What would that do to the future household cost? So that's where you get on the left 3,159. On the far left, we have then taken the base case for entity D and said, well, what if you cannot achieve the efficiencies? WICS have modelled in significant efficiencies for entity D. And we have looked at it and said, well, what if those efficiencies cannot be achieved? What if they can only achieve half of that over the 30-year period? And so that gets you to the 2,217 number. And my key takeaway from that is that the household cost figure in the entity D is not driven purely by the efficiencies claimed by WICS. It is actually driven largely by the aggregation of all of the costs together divided by the number of people in it. Matt.
Dan, just a clarification for councillors on the far left, entity D, the figures that WICS are espousing for the 1640, assumedly that would incorporate the maximum and projected investment as integrated into the 8,000 plus figure for council alone.
Yes.
So they would be using commensurate investment figures. So I guess what I'm suggesting is the premise of a 50% reduction at $3,159 at 2,217 doesn't involve the same reduction.
No, it doesn't. You're absolutely right. The entity D investment scenario is all the individual council scenarios aggregated up into totality. One of the other reasons why the entity D costs are less is also that in the WICS modelling, the councils undertake their 30-year investment every year equally. So your total investment figure divided by 30. Under the entity model, the entity undertakes the majority of its investment, over 75%, in years between years 10 and 30. Sorry, 10 and 30. So it establishes itself, starts to become more efficient, plans, strategizes, and delivers a coordinated program at a lower cost than the individual councils do. So that's one of the other reasons that the entity costs are less than you might otherwise see. I'll do a pause again, Mayor Gary, and I'll offer opportunity for questions on that.
Yes, that'd be good. We'll just see if there's any hands go up for questions. Councillor Ravenclaw.
Just one question around that. This is based on households that are linked to water supply now. It's not based on every household in Southland, the figures. So like our rural farmers that aren't on any water supply, they're on their own water supplies at home. Are these figures based on what the cost will be to them going forward?
It's not as easy to answer that as I first thought it was going to be. The WICS modelling uses an assumption to get to a number of connections. Now that assumption is based on a population number divided by 2.7, which gives you an assumed number of connections. We have down the bottom, through that sensitive analysis, adjusted it for the actual number of connected properties. But in both situations, the charges are only assumed to go to customers who are connected. So if you are not connected to the services, you would not pay. Neither modelling assumes that.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Oh, thank you, Dan. You've done a lot of good work there. I'm wondering on that economic growth, the assumptions on the economic growth in your previous slide, you had 5% or 5.1% on the low ball figure for economic growth. Does that include inflation?
I don't know, but it is. It's really predicated on delivering this investment scenario. So if you start to move the investment scenario so that less is invested, then you are going to reduce that economic output, because the vast majority of it is about jobs delivered to do the physical works to upgrade the system. So I doubt whether there is inflation. It shouldn't include it.
Dan, I think on the basis that
growth figure,
all of the investment figures don't include inflation, given that that figure is predicated on the investment, it's safe to assume that inflation isn't incorporated into those forecasts.
Yeah.
And that economic growth figure, is that the countrywide growth figure? Or is that something else that just relates to this Three Waters?
No, I think that's your regional one, because that says it's calculated, and I think it depends. I haven't actually been asked that before. I think it changes in each region or each district based on the forecast expenditure.
Okay, because I'm just wondering how that flows through to the 2051 figure that we've got there. Like,
it doesn't. They are unconnected pieces, other than it is, there is a total investment within Southland of X million dollars over that period. How many jobs are required to deliver that? It's quite a simple economic analysis.
It's a simple economic analysis. Okay, thanks, Dan.
Councillor Scott, Councillor Rutherford.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this question is going to be easy to answer or not, but just in relation to that infrastructure investment, just on page 34 of that report. So it's got the scale of NTDD they're going to have between $8 and $9 billion invested over that time period, and for SDC we're looking at 151 million over the 10 years. Now, are those cost figures including the administration's, like the staff administration side of it? Because they're talking about these extra jobs that are going to be created under the new structure. Are those administrative and management costs getting factored into that 8 to 9 billion, or is that going to be on top of it? Because when you break that down to a per connection kind of cost, you get like $10,000 for the NCDD, and then you get $18,000 for the council delivery model. So there's quite a big difference in there. And I'm just wondering if some of that's made up with the costs that council currently has under it, the structure of having the staff and everything all there, and when comparing apples with oranges slightly. Does that kind of make sense?
Both figures will have the same, they both assume the same delivery. It's different delivery models, but they will both include the costs required to deliver it as well as delivering it.
Including the additional staff that might be required under.
Yes, yeah. If you're comparing Entity D with council, you need to always remember that Entity D is delivering efficiencies of 50% by the time you get to 2051. So they are saying that Entity D is able to deliver something at half the cost compared to the current council model. So while there's a lot of additional staff, there is massive savings modelled in.
Potential savings.
Potential savings, yes.
Councillor Rodenclaw.
Your worship, thank you. I just want to go back a couple of slides and talking about the presentation 50-50, 6 council, 6 mana whenua. Firstly, how's our voice going to be heard? That's one of my questions down here in Southland. And how are mana whenua, and how are we going to elect these people? On what basis or knowledge, or how is this process going to happen? How are we going to get this governing body right?
At the moment, the government is leaving that open to be developed by each of the entities. So you develop a process that suits your group of councils, and then mana whenua develop the process that suits them to find the representatives. So it's not prescribed as yet.
It's not set in concrete at all, no.
Dan, I think it's also important to note at this point in relation to Councillor Ruddingford's question that our ability to have an influence from a local perspective isn't necessarily from a top-down perspective. A lot of the input that each local area would have would be from the side. So the key planning and strategic documents, the bottom purple box out to the right, and the spatial planning, development planning, master planning context that each region would be providing and feeding into the entity is really where a lot of the critical information and prioritization and impact that local regions have the opportunity to integrate into the entities in conjunction with the letter of expectation and statement of intent proposed process between the governance and the entity itself.
Yeah,
sounds
well made.
okay in practice, but look at where we are with our hospital systems in New Zealand.
And I think your point's a good one. And what I would say is hold on to it, because that's one of the things we want to develop once we get past the reminders about in the model and say, okay, now we know that, let's point out the holes in it and let's see if we can think of what should be in there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Scott.
I was just going to follow on from Councillor Rattencourt, but if we're going to hold that till later, I'll hold mine till later too.
Okay, cheers. Are there any other hands up? I can't see any. Councillor Duffy, Councillor Byers, and Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. I noticed that a big part of, I guess, the cost variation between the projections is about the efficiencies, and I see under the current situation, no efficiencies been allocated to any of the Otago Southern councils outside of Dunedin, who've just been allocated 2.2%, whereas the new model predicts efficiencies of 50 and 53%, which I guess is the major part of the financial difference between the predictions. So is that valid, that assumption, or is that something we should question, that we would actually have no extra efficiency staying on our own, that we haven't, well, I'm not trying to be cynical, but we wouldn't have the nous to have any efficiency on our own?
Yeah, I definitely think it's there is validity in there's one thing about the size of the assumptions, but there's also how the assumptions have been applied. That, Auckland, for example, Auckland has been allocated on, Watercare has been allocated a fraction of the efficiencies that Entity A has been. And Entity A is Watercare plus Far North and Whangarei and Kaipara. And that is well open to challenge, yes. I think.
Yeah. It could actually be less efficient.
Yeah, it could be. But as part of the efficiencies, they're saying, well, there's also this efficiency of actually being able to borrow the amount of money to get on and do the work. There's a whole, I'm not going to defend these efficiencies. I didn't write them, but there has to be some there. The aggregation is going to produce them. When we looked at Otago South, and we saw the opportunity for efficiencies. But to just say that councils will never achieve them and entities always will is a little bit simplistic.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not doubting there's efficiencies. It's just whether it's a whole 50% difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Byers, then Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, just on Councillor Duffy's point there around the efficiencies, large bureaucracies aren't renowned for creating efficiencies. And Councillor Rudenclaw mentioned the Health Board, and they not that long ago, looked for efficiencies and were convinced to get their food from further north. And it's turned out that the promised efficiencies haven't eventuated at all. In fact, the service they've received since has been subpar, but at a similar cost to what they were getting. So big question mark over those efficiencies.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Which brings into account the whole financial equation.
And which, as Dan has said, to keep that in mind when we get the opportunity to discuss that going forward. Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's just a question of clarification, really. So at the moment, ratepayers will be contributing towards Three Waters at the local level. Is the 1,640 additional amount to pay, or will that be reduced effectively because there's already a contribution from the ratepayer towards it?
Council will no longer charge any aspect of Three Waters under the proposed reform. So your charge goes to zero and is replaced by this charge.
Yes, I understand that, but that just means, so for example, I don't know what the average rate would be for Southland District Council. Whatever it is, it would be the gap between that and 1,640. That will be an additional charge. So if, for example, the average rate now is 840 that the district ratepayer pays, that means this amount of 1,640 will be an additional 800 to the ratepayer.
Yes, except let's say your current average rate is 3,000.
Yeah.
And of that, $1,500 is Three Waters.
Yes.
Your new average rate would be 1,500 rather than 3,000.
Yes.
Take out that.
Okay.
The theory is that this would reduce the costs. That's
right.
The whole premise of the government's reform is that this will reduce the cost of the services for the community. I think whether that happens remains to be seen.
Important to note that 1640 is a 2051 figure as well, and there'd be a lot of water to go under the bridge to determine what the starting charge and the associated mechanisms would be for the entities were they to be established and levy their charges.
Right, so it could be a lot higher at the beginning and then reduce.
Or it could be a lot lower at the beginning and increase.
But we don't know. Okay, thank you.
No, but there will be a working groups established once if and when the decision is made that will set principles around the price path for any individual consumer across New Zealand, and they are expected to control the amount at which people's prices can change, so that people don't see significant rises, and so that the entities use their power of their balance sheet to smooth the price paths for people. The final piece of information I just wanted to bring up before we move into the kind of the discussion about the feedback, and that is just to put together the Otago Southland Water collaboration work we did as Morrison Low alongside the WIC stuff. Now they are completely different ways of trying to tackle this problem. You know, our analysis was based on using all the individual LTPs combined up together, additional known projects put in over the top, additional costs put in where we believe they existed. Whereas the WICS is this assumption of future investment based on models calibrated off UK investment scenarios. They give you a different outcome, but the different outcomes are both pointing in the same direction, I guess is my advice and takeaway here. Both of them point to future Three Waters costs going up, driven by changes in regulatory standards and the enforcement regime that sits around them. The scale of those price rises is a bit different, but in both scenarios, we were projecting savings, a lower household cost for the councils in Entity D than in individual service delivery scenarios. The scale of the difference significantly different, and most of that boils down to efficiencies because we're not projecting them at the same level, but they kind of point in the same direction, even though they're done in quite a different process. So now I want to kind of lead us, Mayor Gary, into a bit more of everybody's collective input into it, and a little bit less from Matt and myself, and perhaps just answering questions and guiding through the conversation. And you guys are in a really good position to understand what's being proposed, not just understand what they're saying, but what it actually means for your community. And the questions you're asking and the things you're saying show me that you are. So what I think we want to do is then take okay, if that's what's important, what does it mean for the proposals? Are we seeing the things we need to see? So there are the 4 specific things that DIA want to be fed back on. And then I think there's also some things that Zone 5 and 6 have said, which I think would be another good conversation starter. And then I know there's a series of really local issues. And then perhaps that's the third bit we would get into.
No, that sounds good, Dan. I think we might take a break, though, just for 5 minutes, health and safety break from looking at the screen. Maybe grab an early cup of tea or coffee or something and come back in, say, 10 minutes. Does that suit everybody? I just don't want you all looking at screens for forever. So if we just take a 10-minute break now and come back. So those out online will be back on at 10:20 on the dot. Cheers. We're just going to log on shortly, team, to go live, and then we'll be into it. Just find Matt. Okay, looks like we're recording and we're live. So Dan and Matt, do you want to continue with this part of the presentation, please?
Michael, no, it hasn't started again
It did, it come up live.
yet. Okay.
I don't know what's happened to your microphone, Dan. Are you talking there?
Yeah, I'm back on. Can you hear me
Oh,
now?
cool.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Okay, so the next bit is less slide decks, more talk. So I'm not sure whether you want me to still keep sharing the screen or whether it's better to see people's faces through this part of the discussion.
Probably better to, unless people want to have that as a means of providing more.
The next three slides are pretty much the same as the email that Matt sent out.
Okay.
The 4 things from DIA, then there's the zone 5 and 6 priorities, and then there's local issues. So if people can access that, there's we could go back.
Yes. Some people have only got one screen is the only trouble, Dan, but let's see how it goes with just all talking, unless people want those up there as aid memoirs. It's up to you guys.
Okay.
Let's go.
Okay. So the first one is about the boundaries. Does council feel that there's something there that needs to be responded back?
So there's the question, team. Is there anything around the boundaries? Doesn't appear to be, Dan.
Okay. Right. Then the next 2 probably come together. And one is about the community voice in the system and the influence over local decisions. How do we see that being represented in the model, and also effective representation on the board, and as part of that privatisation, ensuring preventing future privatisation. So I think there'll be some stuff in those ones.
Yeah, definitely. The community voice, we're already hearing community voice around through social media and emails and personal people catching up with councillors and community board members as well. So I think there will be a fair discussion around that. I see some hands going up now. Let's start with Councillor Keys, Councillor Ravenclaw.
Good morning, everyone. Just around the public ownership is a big thing for me, in that how we get the local voice to the entity if this is what we're faced with. And so for me, there has to be, and I can't figure out how you can absolutely 100% ensure. I can't figure out a system that allows you to make sure that this is never privatised, because just the way the system is, I suppose. But it is something that I think we need to feed back on, that is just an absolute given, that it needs to be part of the system. The other part of it is that having that community voice, and it struck me that maybe it's, that the entity is required to report back to the community on the community of interest of where the work is being done, so that there's a real accountability there. And I wondered whether, if we were looking at the system we're currently operating under, whether that would actually end up coming through from maybe like our community boards or something, but then it would probably be smaller than that, even, because more directly the people impacted by an operation.
So this is a local voice as to if maintenance was required or a new subdivision, etc. The whole gambit, really, isn't it, Councillor Keast?
That there's some form of requirement for the entity to actually have that community connection.
Yep, a requirement.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, requirement for community connection.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Ruttenclaw, then Councillor Scott.
Through you, Your Worship, I endorse what Julie said. Oh, sorry, Councillor Keast. Speaking as mana whenua myself, 50-50, Ngāi Tahu and our own representation. Is this a fair representation? And our communities have asked it, and I'm putting it out there.
Okay. Is it fair in which way? Too much or not enough? What do you mean?
Well, is it fair 50% Maori, 50% mana whenua, 50% council representation?
Okay. Okay, Councillor Scott, then Councillor Byers.
Yeah, so just sort of talking about that regional representation group, like, and following on from what Councillor Ruttenclaw just said, if we've got 20 councils we're trying to represent across that whole Takiwa group, and the minister's already kind of indicated that a number for her would be 10 to 12, which kind of makes sense to me as well, because you can't have 40 people trying to have a meeting and discuss stuff, you're not going to get anything done. So in that 10 to 12 people, you've got to halve that for your council representation, because the other half's going to be your iwi representation. So that leaves 5 to 6 people over 20 different TAs across the South Island that have all got very different makeups and needs. And I just don't see how we can get effective representation for that. Like, we look at our own governance structure that we've got with the community boards and the council and everything like that. And it's, if you look at a, sorry, I'm running out of breath, talking too much. If you look at a small community here in Southland, say Athol or Garston or something like that, for example, to get something right through to that upper level, up in wherever it's run out of Christchurch or wherever it's run for a need, like, I just don't see how we can get effective representation under that structure. And like, I broke it down into the current steps that you'd take if you wanted some Three Waters development done. So you currently would go from your community to your community in what, 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. So community to community board to council officers and staff to downers, and then back to the community again. So that's how you get something done. Under the proposed structure, you're going to have community to community board to council to your water rep to your regional group to the entity board to the economic regulator, back to the entity board, to the entity management, to the regional contract manager, to the localised contract manager, to downers, to the community. And I don't see any efficiency gains in all of that sort of convoluted structure. And how is something not going to get lost in all of those different layers? I have some real concerns.
Yeah, I haven't even got an answer for you there, Councillor Scott. I might come back to that one though, because that's quite important, especially when we're looking at the community voice. We've got Councillor Byers, and I think Councillor Menzies, did you have your hand up? No?
No, I didn't.
Okay, Councillor Owen and Councillor Keast. Yep, cool, thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, Southland, as we know, hasn't got a big population. So I think it's a given, really, that we're not going to have any representation or any voice at this new entity level. We would be naive to think that we would. It's pretty clear, isn't it?
No, I'd have to disagree. It would be something that we would be advocating for either locally or definitely through to the least the Merrill Forum. So no, I would struggle to agree with you there, Councillor Byers.
Is that right? Well, Christchurch has got quite a few more people in it than Southland, and we know we've got a population-based funding model for quite a few things.
Yes, and
if you don't have a big population, you don't have much voice.
And with population-based modelling, you've got population-based funding as well. So we've got to take that on board. Hence why there was those discussions way back with this council in regards to district-wide funding of some of the resources we have. So yeah, I just question that, but happy to carry on the discussion.
Okay, well, I don't question that, and I don't think we'll have any say.
No, okay. Councillor Owen, Councillor Keys, Councillor Fraser.
Well, thank you. I think it's probably quite good to break down at what points the community would want to have a voice in a proposed operational structure like this. And in my experience, it's when something new is proposed. So when, for example, a wastewater system needs replacing because it's come to the end of its life, and what system that looks like. So that's one aspect. The other is when something goes wrong, something minor goes wrong, and wanting some immediate action on that. And the other is when something major goes wrong, like, for example, in recent times when, for example, the Riverton community was unhappy with the high calcium levels in their water source and needing that addressed. So I think there's probably different ways in which to enable that community voice to come through. Some of those might be through that, I don't know the wording of it, but the type of ombudsman type role that's sort of in the regulator. If people feel like the things are just being done unfairly or something like that, or they're not getting a fair crack, like that's one mechanism. The complaints side, I think that's a really tricky one, particularly, if you're going to a call centre in Christchurch or something like that, and having that dealt with quickly and effectively, and how things are prioritised as well, in terms of if an entity has a limited amount of funding and they are dealing with an issue, they're probably going to go with where the likely biggest impact is. Like, for example, if we have a major natural disaster or something like that, they're probably going to deal to the areas with the higher population needs first, because there's better bang for buck in terms of priorities. So there's sort of different layers and different ways in which community voice. But I think one of the big opportunities potentially we have here for a mechanism is potentially through either council or community boards when it comes to the new development side of stuff. I think the power could be put quite firmly in the hands of the local community in terms of the water. At one extreme, you could have the water regulator could be required to come up with options and present them back to a local community, and the local community chooses which option it prefers out of the ones. It could go to that extreme, whereby the water regulator has, 3 options for ways that it wants to deal. It knows what the cost implications are can break down what the cost implications are for the local community, and put it back in the hands of the community to decide which one they can afford. And I think that came through a little bit when I was reading the Ngāi Tahu comments, in terms of where sometimes, for example, they want that ability for if a highest level of service is wanted in a particular area, for that local top up to occur, rather than being limited by what the national entity says. So I think the community boards have potential, or community boards or council or some sort of way, or whether it's when a new, for example, with your Te Anau wastewater treatment, where you set up a specific liaison group there, like you could take that to another level and, say that actually the local community is best placed to decide what's affordable and choose which option suits their values. And the water entity could propose what options. So, that's what I'm suggesting as an option we could feed back to them.
The Te Anau model certainly worked very well. I like that, Councillor. And can I just go through yours again? So there would be the 3 different things: the consent process, and then minor, and then major works, and then disaster type operations. And then obviously a complaints process if things weren't working. Is that what I'm picking up? Thank you. Councillor Keast, and then Councillor Fraser.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. In response to Margie's or Councillor Ruddenclaw's point about the Ngāi Tahu representation, I think that's actually a strength, because it gives us the ability to, from my point of view, I see that they will hold true to the principles that they've lay in their documentation, which is that this must retain and be maintained in public ownership. So I think that that is a real strength in having greater representation there with that view. The questions that the other councillors have raised about the population or a convoluted connection to the actual community or where the service is being provided is something that I think we need to ensure that that's part of my what I was talking about, having a requirement that they are connecting with local, so that that input about what is required or seen to be desirable locally is taken into effect. That as for how you would decide what the I don't think you can use population base as a means for deciding who would be representing the councils in this role. I think that it should perhaps be more based on the numbers of entities or something, like the number of, like, we've got so many wastewaters and so many water supplies, whereas council's probably only got one, or Invercargill's only got one. So the complexity of what we would see is needed is far higher than what others with population base that supports a standardised system actually allows. So could we put something into our feedback along that line?
So base it on actually the infrastructure within that community, within that council, rather than the numbers.
Yeah, rather than numbers, be more of a. I think that would be a better. Give us maybe some more accountability, but the other side of this that I see is really important is making sure that, and I'm not sure whether it's the entity or whether it's to the regulator, Te Mata Arawai, that the whole system needs to be geared up so that it's really into research and development, so that the new systems they need to think, like Councillor Byers is saying, they need to see the waste as a resource. So they're actually thinking of different ways of using it rather than just disposing it, because there is a whole lot of resource held in that waste or provision of water, or however we're going to do it. We really need to get on top of get away from the traditional means of doing it and embrace technology in that regard. I see that if the regulator was involved in that and was putting it out that this will work under these conditions, there's a whole lot of that efficiency to be gained by that, because it's across the board. It's for New Zealand. It's not something that is a risk, that is set to one area to actually develop their systems.
Yeah, so that's part of the community voice, is to listen to what new technologies, etc. are. Absolutely.
Well, I think actually we need to ask for it to be even stronger than that. They need to come up with new technologies. They need to be researching this and looking after it, not necessarily the entity. Maybe it's the system and the regulator.
Okay, Councillor Fraser, Councillor Kramer.
Councillor Keister's brought up a couple of the points that I was going to raise, and I think that the last point she made about as a bigger organisation, there's that ability to chase the technology, to chase the next solution, and I think that's one area that could be really powerful, and it ties in with what Councillor Byers has also said. I guess the real concern for me is where it all comes to prioritisation, and we see it in roading. And how do we ensure that the local priority isn't lost because we're small? And that's, I don't have a solution, but I just see that's a real concern. How do we keep that local voice being heard? The guy who lives in Centre Bush, who knows exactly where every stormwater drain is and exactly how it works, and there's a problem and he knows the solution because he just knows it, because he lives it. And how does that kind of still get heard? And I think we can lose it now. So that's the huge concern for me, for our small communities. And I like that idea that the complexity of our system, there needs to be that voice, whether it's a balance of rural to city council, kind of representatives, but that voice of the rural and the small communities needs to be on that representative group. So that would be something I'd like to see, almost like a mandatory. Some of the places on that board are rural or small communities, some would be larger.
Yep. So your rural, your metro, your urban, your everything's city.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you don't get it dominated by the, oh, we've got one system people.
Yep. Cool. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. Yeah, just following on from Councillor Keast and the new technologies. Well, managing the human manure, there's old technologies that have been around for a long time. And we really have to get our head around this because we have lots of small communities across Southland. We're not a big city that can afford one big treatment plant. I mean, look at Te now. That's going to cost us a lot of money. It already has. But there's old technology. And I had a chap telling me the other day about the golf course he visited in Brisbane. And all down the fairways was lined with trees, fruit trees and all sorts. They were just vibrant, lush stuff. And they were walking along playing golf and eating all this fruit. Then they got back to the clubhouse and here were two big water tanks that had been converted to a compost toilet system. So rather than putting the human manure, human waste down these expensive pipes, fragile pipes, first earthquake, they break or flood or whatever, wash it, taking it away down with water down to the big treatment plant, they just manage it right where it's created, compost it there, then take it out under the trees and create all this wonderful food that supports the club financially.
I get that, Councillor Byers, but we have to get that into a somehow make sure that sort of advice or suggestions or possible solutions gets the community voice. So that's where we're going with this part of this conversation.
All of these numbers and reports and what have you that we've had are based on the new technology, like the TRNL systems.
Yep.
So that's why it's so expensive. But South, we know that the ratepayers are already paying a lot of money. A lot of people can't afford to pay what they're already paying. So we need to do things a wee bit differently.
Certainly promote it.
Otherwise, we're going to lose infrastructure.
Yeah. We can
through you, Your Worship, I think in terms of feedback through to central government, there's certainly an opportunity to ensure there's a feedback note around service delivery innovation and the importance of retaining this as a fundamental tenet of any new environment or entity.
Yep, I appreciate that comment, Mr. Russell. Now I've sort of lost my track. I think it's Councillor Owen. Yes, Councillor Owen.
Oh, thank you. Just following on from Don's comments, I think something that we need to be mindful of, and although we don't want declining rural communities in Southland District, that is the trend is that increased urbanisation, and sometimes a rural treatment may no longer be viable to, or might not be able to meet the new standards. And it may be more desirable to go back to more self-sufficient systems around own rainwater collection and things like that. And I can't see that an entity like that is proposed is naturally going to want to get more people off their books. So I think how we keep a local voice in that, in terms of where a community may decide that we can no longer afford to have our communities system rainwater collection, and things change as well. There might be reasons why, for example, mining in a community might be a reason why that they haven't been able to have their own rainwater collection in the past, and if that ends, then they may be able to go back to other more self-sufficient systems. So I think being able to have that I
think that's a really good point, Councillor Owen. And being able to capture that as far as identification of declining smaller populations, and perhaps being able to transition those from source water supplies treatment to supply point supply in as an exception rather than a rule, obviously, but for that provision to be accounted for, in particular for rural communities.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Russell. That's exactly right. And this is all part of the submission, for want of a better term, that we will put to government, is that the community voice is to include those type of suggestions. Dan, have you got your hand up there for a comment?
Yes, I did. I thought that was quite a nice place to segue to one of the other elements that the DIA have specifically asked for feedback around, and that's integration of growth planning and water services planning.
But just before you move on there, I think Councillor Menzies might have a question around voice, community voice.
Thank you. I do. Obviously, with the proposed numbers in that representation area, it's going to rely on a high trust model of the local government and those representatives. And for me, what's important is that there are processes set in whereby local councils are able to address issues that come through, if it is instituted over the next week. So it's that process stuff that's going to be really important, and our ability to have a fair process to raise those concerns, as much as it will be for that representation group goes on it, be subject to a change process and how often that occurs. And then alongside that is also a robust complaint system for the individual ratepayer who's striking an issue, or community boards or whoever. So that's where the strength of that system can be tested by the number of issues that might be forwarded, and indeed how they are resolved with that community or council or individual in mind, and then that's fed back to the local areas. Thank you.
And the term, or the term ombudsman was used earlier, but yeah, there has to be certainly that robust system in place. Just
what I might say,
the community stuff with Naitahu have said that throughout this whole process they don't want ghost communities, I think the word, ghost villages or ghost communities throughout this process. So certainly a very close eye on that. Councillor Duffy, have you got a comment around the community voice before we move on to Dan?
Yes, Mayor Gary. I'm just thinking, I'm often a bit cynical about mission statements and so on, but I think it's important that this entity has a very robust mission statement that is actually about the communities it's serving across the board, rather than, so that there's not a focus on the big metros, or, there's a bit of holistic stuff, I think, to what's actually going on here. Water is the lifeblood of our existence. And so a lot of those issues we're talking about, such as declining communities and so on, we've got to be careful that we take long-term views looking at this sort of thing. And I think so the attitude that we have about Three Waters is very, very important from the outset, and that's adhered to. And it gives me some comfort, I think, the iwi involvement there, that would actually be upheld more through that if we ever became, God forbid, a purely profit-driven sort of a entity. And I can't help thinking too that while we're thinking about all of the people that are connected, we need to be mindful of the ones that aren't, in terms of not shoveling costs onto them that aren't justified, but also finding other ways that they perhaps could be provided clean water in a different method and a different cost and all the rest of it. So we need to think of the well-being of the whole population, I guess. So that's all.
No, very good comment around the mission statement. I like that, Paul. Thank you. Okay, Dan.
Thanks, Mayor Gary. As part of that last conversation, I was just going to draw back to something Matt said earlier, that this model is designed for those community accountabilities to be coming in at the side through those key documents rather than down the line. And also to say, I've lost count the number of council workshops I've been in the last 8 weeks. And you have come up with more concrete ideas in the last 45 minutes than all of the rest of them combined. There's actually some really good thoughts there for what you do that you say needs to be in a model to improve it. So well done for that.
The team have certainly been keeping an eye on this for some time, Dan, and yeah, I acknowledge that the amount of stuff that they've had to read over time, and certainly the briefings that Matt has given us and Cameron have been perfect. Yeah, so.
Yeah. So one of the other aspects is this integration between growth planning and water services, and the provision of the Three Waters infrastructure would be provided by the utility, Entity D, whereas council is still responsible for the overall growth planning of your district. And how do we ensure that those two things are aligned so Southland gets the growth of its community it needs, but also that you continue to have an economic development lever if you want to use it? There are councils, and you may be one of them, that use provision of water services to encourage investment in your business and your community, and you might provide lower costs or a different cost model to bring business in or to keep business. And are there issues like that you need this model to recognise, and what ideas would you have for those?
Thoughts, team? Any thoughts on that one? Don't appear to. Oh, hang on, we've got a hand up somewhere. Councillor Douglas. Unmute, John. John, unmute, and then Councillor Keast.
Am I?
Yep. Yep.
Unmuted? Go. Yep. So.
Oh, you're on, John. Oh, you were on. You're off again now. That's it. You're on.
No.
Don't touch it.
Right. Go to the next person, Gary. I'll come back.
Okay, Councillor Keast.
Thank you, Mayor Tom. I'm wondering if the focus of this entity is actually based on environmental outcomes. So there's where you have a growth area, or you see the need to develop a growth area, that it's the feedback or the ability to get things done is based on the environmental impact that having growth come into an area would have, so that you can get more action going, because it's a logical thing to do now that there's too many people living in this area to draw on the water bores that are around, or there's too many people in this area to actually have their own individual systems, septic tank systems or other systems that they are disposing of their waste in that matter. And so that view that if it's environmental, we're guarding against environmental degradation, surely that coming into the entity's attitude towards taking on more work might be a way around that, being able to up the ante and get the work done.
Mm. Yeah. So you think the focus around the economic stuff, Councillor Keast, should include the environmental parts of things? I just try to pick up the environmental impact.
Yes.
And cultural, or just environmental?
Works. They work together. They work together.
Mr. McIntosh has just put, why don't we just have it that includes the 4 well bands?
Perfect wording. Yep.
Cool.
Or you could even look at the developmental, the growth, the United Nations growth or sustainable growth goals.
Yeah.
Coming in there.
Okay, thank you for that. Very good. Councillor Douglas, are you okay with the question
now?
Yeah,
sure. Hopefully you've got me now. Under the growth model, this entity would be looking the way I read it was for development contributions. Now, currently as a council, we don't collect development contributions. So that is a change that we would have to make, or is that a change that we would negotiate with the entity?
That's not wouldn't be our cup of tea, would it, Mr. Russell? You might, no. No, it wouldn't be.
Through you, Your Worship, my interpretation of that would be that as developments are requested, that the entity itself would define what funding is required under a contribution policy and levy that through their avenue, although I think that's certainly a worthwhile topic to capture and seek clarification on. It's a really good point.
Yes, some alignment with the council's position on development contributions and the entities would be, is a fair point to make.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks for that, Councillor Douglas. Councillor Scott and Councillor Owen.
Thanks, Your Worship. I'm kind of struggling to see when we're talking about growth, just to see where that sort of fits into the role of that structure. But I think if you take it back to what we've got here with our own sort of structures and what we're doing with the community boards and those community board plans and everything, it's how do we, once we get those community board plans sorted out, which will feed into the growth model for our long-term plan and everything, when all that works out, do we rely on the regional representation group to kind of feed that through, or does that fit through the economic regulator side, or does that, I just struggle to see where you feed into this process from that. And
regulator.
And I have some concerns around that.
I think it'd be the regulator, but Mr. Russell's got his hand up there.
I think our understanding, Councillor Scott, is that an entity would be required to have regard for the various regional spatial planning exercises that were undertaken around the country and integrate that into their planning and prioritisation process and subsequent works program. And so, look, there are some elements there, in particular in relation to the Resource Management Act reforms that are currently underway that will have an impact on how that feed-in mechanism occurs. But what we understand from that process as it's currently evolving is that that would be a more regional focus as opposed to an individual territorial authority focus, and that all of those considerations and stakeholders, so as an example, DOC, local mana whenua, community boards, councils, these are all examples of stakeholders that would feed into those regional plans and would subsequently feed into the entity and their prioritisation and works program development, and that would be mandated.
Do you still see a competing risk though with that growth, like when you're competing with an area like Central Otago and Wanaka and that sort of thing? Like it's on a relative scale, like growth for us and growth for Wanaka are two totally different sort of things, and I see a real risk in that we're having to compete with any other council in the South Island or area, and that's where our economy of scale or lack of comes in with our population base and everything. Like we might be growing one of our small towns which has only got a population of 200 or 300 as opposed to a town that's got 20,000. So you can see a bigger amalgamated entity, and we've seen it in other areas, and we've talked about health and everything too. And I mean, I've got a very localized example of that here where we were competing with Wanaka and we lost, and you can see the ramifications for that now coming through, and it was based on that equitable and equality across the whole wider area, and the smaller one was the loser, and I don't want to see that happening in this.
Couldn't agree more, Councillor Scott. So look, one of the notes I've taken here for integration into a feedback comment to central government was Councillor Keith's comment around the concern that we have around population-based decision making and ensuring that that isn't a disadvantage to smaller population bases. So that will certainly be part of the feedback that we provide.
Thank you, Matt. So Councillor Owen, Councillor Kramer, Councillor Byers.
You. When I'm thinking about growth, I'm thinking about separating in my mind the household, like population growth based stuff, and then the industry based growth. And from a forward planning perspective, we have district plans kind of allow for, where they see the, by zoning and things like that, indications of where we see growth there. And from an industry perspective, sometimes that's comes through in like an economic development strategy or something like that. So those are a couple of tools that I think that we have that could feed back. But to a large part, these things are not determined by council or anyone's plans or strategies. They're determined by what the private interest and investment in these things making them happen is. And so those timeframes are out of our control. But I think potentially through district plan zoning and rules and economic development strategies, we can communicate to another entity where we envisage potential growth might occur in the future. But some prioritisation of planning for those might come down to when the timing of when the private investment might show up to make those occur. So I guess, yeah, those are tools I was thinking that might be helpful.
No, very good, Councillor Owen. I'll mute. Oh, that's not going to work, Matt. Sorry, we're just having trouble with the sound in here. Just give us half a second. We'll go back to what we were doing. Just remind people, if you're not speaking, can you please just mute your mics because we're getting a bit of feedback coming back here. Thanks, Councillor Owen. Councillor Kramer and Councillor Byers. Oh, you passed. Councillor Owen did that. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. I just wanted to note that all these issues that we've talked about this morning, there hasn't been one satisfactory sort of resolution or result or way of sort of reconciling these concerns with this proposed new entity, and I guess that's just a symptom of what we're proposing here and releasing control of this water infrastructure. So I just think it's quite noticeable that these concerns that have been raised really don't have any sort of there's no way of getting around them with some sort of relief for our community.
Well,
so,
as Dan said, if we don't put these forward, they won't be heard. So this is the time that they need to be heard. This is the time that Minister Mahuta has said, get your concerns or any opinion or any solutions to us by the end of September. Otherwise, it won't be heard. So we can...
okay, well, I'm just concerned that we shouldn't be losing control. Our communities shouldn't be losing control of the water infrastructure.
Absolutely agree with you, and that's what is certainly one of the
putting that in there.
Absolutely, that's gone out nationally as well. That's number one under the sun, actually, in regards to the Takiwā feelings across the board.
But that doesn't include that ownership issue, Gary. I'm saying the community as it stands today shouldn't be losing control of the water infrastructure. We talked about new entity and the supposed ownership of that. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying, well, that's not satisfactory.
Okay. So you're talking ownership and control. Councillor Owen.
Leave it where it is in the community and deal with it there.
Sorry, Councillor Owen, did you have your hand up there?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just before we moved on to the segment, Dan just touched on something from the previous one, which was around community voice being envisaged as coming through those strategic plans type thing. I think we need to make sure that we feed back to government that that's not appropriate. I struggle to say, I see highly intelligent people who previously have been heavily involved in submitting on reading intense documents and stuff like that and submitting. And the reality is people just don't have the time to do that. And so I don't think we can rely on that as a process for informing local views. I think it needs to be far more proactive than expecting our community members to read strategies and plans and provide formal feedback. So.
Get that. Thank you. Councillor Rutherford.
Through you, Your Worship, thank you. As a rural farmer, I'd like to go forward on this. How will we be effective? There's no modelling in this document for the farmer, and going forward, I'd like to have in the proposal or the questions going to government around this. How will the rural farmer voice be heard in the future?
Okay, so that's in the community voice one. You wanted that, not an economic.
Specifically around the farming sector.
When you say farmers, do you mean farmers who are not connected to Three Waters?
Yeah. Because originally there was discussion around any property that had more than one supply or one house or two a connect. You know, it's that going forward we're going to have some regulation around it. So we need to have a look at that now, because we're setting up a body with 50-50 representation, but where's the farmer's voice in this?
Okay, so
Your Worship, Councillor Ruddingpour, what you're referring to is the regulatory reforms rather than the service delivery reforms. So the regulatory reform has effectively occurred. Taumata Arawai is established, the new regulatory framework is in place. The opportunity to change that is effectively been and gone. And that formed part of the combined submission that we contributed to and issued through to central government at the beginning of the year.
So I picked up from your comment, Councillor Runniclaw, that you wanted that in the communication going forward, not the past, because as been pointed, that has been it's been under the microscope ever since the Ministry of Health, to tell you the truth. It's just been taken over now by Taumata Arawai. Councillor Scott, Councillor Duffy. Oh, sorry, Councillor Owen was it first? No. Councillor Scott, Councillor Duffy.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just clarification, just on my earlier question about those levies. I've got notes everywhere here, and I found more of what that was in relation to, and that was around what Councillor Rutherford was just talking about. So for those private suppliers that aren't going to be connected to the network per se, there's going to be obviously some levies to the regulator to cover the costs of regulating them. So that's just a bit more context around that levies question as well, and what the costs are going to be for these private suppliers. And under the structure that's going forward as of basically now. If that makes sense.
No, I'm a bit lost.
So with the new regulator that's set up now.
Yep.
And I was asking before about the levies that council's going to potentially pay, because we're running under a status quo at the moment until whatever changes happen. So my original question was, are there going to be levies for us to this Taumata Arawai now? But what about these farmers and private suppliers that are supplying more than 2 or 3 households from a supply? Do they have, they're not currently paying rates for water. Are they going to have a levy that's going to come through for this new regulator in the short term?
Yeah, I know that question's been asked as a trustee of Ball and Lodge. What would it mean for the future, but we haven't had an answer. I would think.
Have you got any context there that you want to add?
No, I don't think I can answer that question any further. I think Mayor Gary's right. That needs to be asked. The whole private supply issue has moved significantly from the early stages when the position was very strong that anybody who supplies anyone is going to be regulated under the same rules. That has definitely moved. There's been a recent change to the Water Services Bill that will extend timeframes to take into account how much they've learned about rural supplies. There is a document now that sets out what acceptable solutions will be, which is going to allow local source solutions rather than force everybody to have water safety plans, things like that. But it's a fair question to say, will there be any levies on private suppliers from the water regulator? Absolutely. Then Mayor Gary, perhaps I see one more question on this, but it seems like it's probably time to move on to the next sort of series of questions.
Councillor Duffy.
It was basically the same question, just expanding it out to halls and golf clubs and those sorts of things as well.
Yep, absolutely. And I know the same question has been asked of Marais as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Okay, Dan, thank you. Next topic.
So the next group of things to discuss was around the Zone 5 and 6 themes that have been represented. And we thought maybe it's an opportunity for the council to look at those and see whether they want to confirm those or whether there's more they wanted to add in. I can flash them up on the screen, or if everybody's got access to them on the emails, they could see them that way.
For a couple of minutes as a reminder would be great. Thanks.
Let me just remember how to do this. Share screen. Share. So we are on to, there we go. And put that up. There we go. So these are Zone 5 and 6 themes. So these are reasonably similar to what you've been talking about, but there's a couple of specific elements in here that haven't actually come up. So perhaps if we open the floor again for a round of comments or questions, statements, we'll get a council position from here.
Yeah, that's how. Any comments or questions from anybody? Oh, Councillor.
Yeah, can I just ask for clarification, Dan? The council have an opportunity to be involved in development criteria for board appointments. Is that still correct?
When you say correct, I'm not sure what you mean.
I wasn't sure whether at the Zone 5 and 6 meetings, whether that was actually discarded, whether we didn't really have that opportunity. I may be wrong. That's why I'm seeking that clarification.
Through you, Your Worship, these are themes that Zone 5 and 6 had communicated through to central government that they would like to ensure are integrated into the reform proposal, and don't feel as though it's been confirmed or is as clear as it could or should be.
No, okay, that's good.
So just to clarify that, so what we will be doing is giving this a tick, Dan, is that what you're asking, that we reaffirm the these themes that were forwarded by Zone 5 and 6?
Yeah, it was, yep. Thinking that they come through as well from the council or not.
I can't see any hands up for discussion of that. I certainly support them. Oh, Councillor Duffy.
Look, I'm sorry, I just can't take the damned hand down, Gary.
Oh, okay. No worries. We can do that from here. Look at that.
It's good, thank you.
We can put you to bed too.
Yeah, well, that'd be good.
Right, no worries.
I haven't read the paper yet.
Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. I was just wondering, that first sentence, was that retain local ownership or input? What was?
Oh, that does appear to be a typo.
I don't think it was ownership. No, I haven't got it open in front of me. I'm sorry. You might have to put that back up, Dan.
Local input.
Input, yeah. It wasn't ownership.
Input wasn't on it. And I just didn't see the second page. There was another page there, wasn't there?
That's the next group of things to talk about.
Okay.
It's specific.
So the first one up is the zone 5 and 6 matters that have already gone forward to Minister Mahuta. So what we're asking here is that we give it the tick to support that, include that in our document going north, that we support the zone 5 and 6. Personally, I think we should. Councillor Owen.
Yeah, just maybe just a little bit of clarification would be good on what same service means. The same level of service, is that same level of service as what they're receiving now, or same level of service consistently across?
It's the same level of service consistently across the new entity if it was set up, and that includes that local input be used, which we discussed at one of our workshops some time ago in regards to having local contractors first up and remaining so. Does that make sense? It doesn't look like it does.
No, I think it's just probably summarised too much. Maybe I need to read some more details behind their specific point, but yeah, just not clear to me just from one sentence what it.
Yep. Okay, it looks like we've got the go ahead with that one, Dan.
Okay, so then the next group of sort of feedback to collect up and put together was around local issues, and perhaps it's better that someone locally talks about that. So I might throw over to Matt, because he's got a kind of a number of particular issues that I think will help push the conversation along.
Sure. Okay, so I am assuming that you will have all had an opportunity to read the email that I flicked out earlier in the week that comprised of some examples associated with perhaps some of the local voice issues. Obviously, there's some key themes that DIA, the Department of Internal Affairs, have identified. They're seeking feedback on Zone 5 and 6, which we've talked about. We've had a really good roundtable discussion, and I've got a huge list of items there that between Dan and myself will work up and finesse, and that I'll repeat before we wrap up the discussion today. But then there's also some, I guess, some peripheral type issues that it's probably still important that we keep on the radar. And one of the examples I've used is the as identified in the Department of Internal Affairs No Worse Off package that has been communicated out to the sector. See, Southland District Council's debt levels sit at estimated at about $19.2 million, which is accurate. However, the stranded overhead costs have been calculated at roughly $2 million per year. We know from the work that we've done with Morris and Lowe, the RFI information that was produced, that our figure is closer to 3 million rather than 2 million. This is a significant difference, and if we aren't successful in getting that for the period available from central government, if the reforms were to go ahead, then our ratepayers would be out of pocket, making up that difference. So from my perspective, that's an important example of feedback that we need to be providing. Councillor Menzies.
Yes, thank you. Just to endorse those comments, there's I guess the promise of no and not any worse off, and that's a key example of we would be worse off.
Absolutely.
Councillor Scott and Councillor Harper.
And just in relation to that as well, when we talk about council not being worse off, that if I understand it correctly, 50% of that's actually getting funded from the water entity itself, which is getting funded by the ratepayers. So we're kind of charging the ratepayers to make sure that the ratepayers aren't going to be worse off. So I think part of that, if I understand that correct, is kind of we're robbing Peter to pay Peter.
I think the no worse off allocation actually comes out of the Crown, but irrespective, the Crown gets its money from the same people that the water entity gets its money from, same people you get your money from. So it's still Peter and Paul still covering the costs.
So, and if it's the water user, isn't it? The end user that's paying for this. We just got to be careful that we're not using the word rates.
Absolutely. And look, one of the other critical examples included in the email earlier in the week was the need to ensure there's a streamlined transfer process for rural schemes to community ownership. So the reason why I've proposed that as a feedback element is that there's potentially going to be some rural schemes within our communities that aren't keen to have their assets and control over their service delivery transferred to a new entity, given that the primary purpose of that infrastructure is potentially to provide stock water rather than drinking water. At the moment, as we understand it, that process for the transfer of those assets back to community ownership is a reasonably convoluted process. We've got a reasonably local example of that in the Otama water scheme with our neighbours, Gore District Council. I understand that that's potentially required a parliamentary bill to enable that process to occur. And look, we've got 3 years to, if these reforms are to go ahead, we've got 3 years to get on top of those sorts of things internally, and we need an efficient process to achieve that. So look, it's my advice that forms part of the advice that we provide back to central government. In another related matter, supply point treatment options. Dan was referencing this not long ago as technical advice that has been provided by DIA, and as we understand it, that again this is an onerous, expensive supply point treatment option that perhaps isn't quite as fit for purpose as we might like it to be. So ensuring that there is some appropriate alternative options available is important. Look, I'm going to leave it there because again, this is about feedback from yourselves rather than feedback from staff. So I was keen to get an understanding of whether or not there's some broader peripheral feedback that we'd like to provide in addition to what's been proposed.
Thanks, Mr. Russell. Councillor Harper.
Yes, Your Worship. I was just asking a question. I'm going to ask Mr. Russell a question on the rural schemes to community ownership, please. He's just answered that, so that's good. Thank you. So I can mute myself again.
That's okay. So, right. So, any other feedback in regards to this? Right, Dan. Go on. Dan on that.
So look, I'll just take the opportunity before I hand back to Dan just to confirm that those suggestions that I've just covered is council happy for those to be included as part of the feedback. Of course, you'll get an opportunity to review any and all of the items that have been raised today as we take them offline and finish them to bring them back for comment and ratification in the coming weeks.
I can't see your head shaking, there, Mr. Russell, so I appreciate that.
Really, just as the last part of this, Mayor Gary and councillors, was to, most councils whose responses I see coming through are developing, here's our feedback, here's the issues we have with the model, here's what we want to see, but they are describing some aspects as bottom lines, effectively saying we cannot countenance this unless this is in there. And I wondered if within what's been discussed today, there was similarly some things for council that you're saying from our community perspective, these are the absolute bottom lines. And it might be that that's easier to articulate once you've seen it all come back to you and presented. And that's the time to kind of
I think that might be the best approach, Dan. The other components we haven't spoken about as yet that are included within the report are the baseline principles that Ngāi Tahu have created and articulated through to central government, and whether or not there's, in the same way that council have opted to support the Zone 5-6 non-negotiables, council would similarly like to offer its support to the Ngāi Tahu baseline or shared priorities is the way in which they've described those principles.
So that's page 23, item 17, just as a reminder.
Thank you, Your Worship. So as Mayor Gary's articulate, Councillor Owen.
I just wanted to say I was really heartened by what I read from their shared principles and would be happy to support those. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Owen. I think I'm getting this same feel around the table. Any bit of head nodding, thumbs up. Awesome, thank you.
So look, now might be an appropriate time for me to recap what Dan and I have heard from you during this session. As Dan indicated earlier, we've got quite a significant amount of feedback here to take away and consolidate and finesse and get back to you for further refinement and feedback ahead of submitting to central government. We've got a September 30 deadline that we'll be working towards, so we'll turn this around reasonably quickly. But to summarise, in no particular order, at this stage, Southland District Council, we're okay with the boundary as proposed theoretically. If it was to go ahead, no real feedback in relation to the boundary. Ensuring the local voice is integrated into any entity and environment moving forward, and the feeling that the governance model, ownership model as represented currently, is too convoluted. Effectively, the spatial planning input and the representative structure above the entity model does not provide adequate input for the local voice, and we'd like to see some alternative mechanisms, and perhaps we can utilise our Tiana wastewater project committee format as an example of how that might be achieved moving forward. In terms of what that voice involves, we look to have split it into what I interpreted as three key categories: complaints that might go through an ombudsman, service delivery complaints, which would be operational or perhaps emergency in nature, and the future space involving priorities, spatial planning, involving community boards, council, committees. The importance of retaining public ownership, both now and into the future, and what assurances that we can get around that. The concern we have with population-based decision-making as a mechanism for decision making. And other considerations to integrate into that is perhaps the complexity of the systems and infrastructure, the isolated nature of some of these, the level of service provision that, comparatively speaking, some of our residents either have access to or more importantly don't have access to, and how those factors are considered in decision making. There was a sentiment there that rural representation must have a seat at the table at all times in some way, shape or form. There's obviously rhetoric or narrative out there around the cyclical nature of the representation structure. It's important that however that is undertaken, rural representation is provided at all times. Declining populations and the need to retain the option to transition away from reticulated supplies in an appropriate and managed way was spoken about. So potentially the example for water supply would be from source water supply treatment to supply point treatment, and some of the options and innovative options to Councillor Byers' point that might be available in that regard. Councillor Duffy spoke about the need to ensure there's a robust mission statement necessary to reflect commitment to all customers, including the rural community as well as the urban and metro connected population. And I guess a related topic to that was the integration of the four well-beings and the need to ensure that approach is reflected from top to bottom throughout, not just in the mission statement, but throughout the operational mandate for the entity. Detail regarding the integration of population that aren't connected. How would this be approached? And it was Councillor Ruddencore that was talking to the rural farmer, and Councillor Duffy referencing community halls and sports clubs. Those that aren't connected, how are they considered within the framework of service delivery, both now and into the future, both from a regulatory perspective and from a service delivery perspective? What are the avenues to service those parts of our community into the future? And what say do those parts of the community have to ensure that their voice is represented in the discussion moving forward? I've touched on project delivery and the Te Anau delivery model local project committee example that we'll utilise. The alignment of development contributions policies from council and any proposed entity, and how that's managed to ensure that they're levied in an appropriate and commensurate manner, to ensure that no one or other party is disadvantaged or worse, development is discouraged and through that process. The community voice through spatial planning was felt that this is too convoluted, and as I said earlier, there needs to be other mechanisms. It was Councillor Owen circling back there. And levies on the rural farmer, community halls, sports clubs for Taumata Arawai regulatory services. What clarity is able to be provided at this point in relation to those services? We were comfortable supporting the non-negotiables produced by the Zone 5 and 6 Forum. We were also comfortable supporting the baseline shared priorities that Ngāi Tahu have proposed and communicated. The need to ensure there is an efficient rural scheme transfer, ownership transfer, and the need to ensure that there's an affordable, effective and viable supply point option for those that aren't connected to a reticulated source water drinking water supply. It's felt that what is currently proposed is too onerous, too expensive, and as a result not viable. So that's that's what I have noted down in front of me. Apologies if I've missed anything. I'm keen to hear if there's anything else at this point that you'd like added to the list. Councillor Duffy, you and Councillor Keast.
Yes, Matt, it's just one word. Earlier on, you said the word talked about water supply. I'm just wondering if it'd be better to use the word service, which applies more to the whole three.
Will do. Thanks, Councillor Duffy. Councillor Keast.
Thank you, Matt. I didn't really hear in there the strength around that new technologies or old technologies, but alternatives ways of actually going forward. Is there enough, are we putting enough emphasis on that? You can consider that point. And also, should we be giving more or asking the question around the charges? I feel that we need assurance that those that can't afford the costs will actually have continued supply or services, and that there will be support from other sources likes of WINS or government, although I suppose in the big money go round, it's a different thing, for those costs to be covered where people genuinely cannot afford these costs, as opposed to it just being a cost recovery, that can't afford it. So it comes back to the individual, to the entity just recovering that from the other customers or other consumers, because I think it needs to be a wider spread than just a lot,
Yeah, and that'll gel with the submission from Mayor Carter in Northland.
Really good points, Councillor Keast. I actually did have service delivery innovation jotted down. I apologise, I skipped over that for some reason. And yeah, look, affordability support and policy position for any proposed entity is a really valid and important message to get out there. We've had, as per previous information provided, we understand we've got approximately 22% of our district is on a fixed income, and increasing costs will absolutely be a struggle for some, if not all of them.
Councillor Scott, Councillor Myers, Councillor Owen.
Thank you. Just sort of going back to what I sort of said at the start and following on from what Councillor Menzies said about the other reforms that are happening at the moment and the speed at which this one's going, I just want to sort of say again about, I think we need to slow down the trajectory that they're trying to do. I don't think there's any need to rush all of this reform. And I mean, we've pulled out today a whole lot of questions that are still unanswered and a whole lot of information that needs to be done. And I really do feel that there's some strength in that Taumata Arawai regulated model where they can actually utilise some of that in the meantime. And maybe this pauses as long as the whole local government reform happens to come up with a full-on model for this down the track. And testing someone like the economic regulator sitting inside Taumata Arawai and putting some government funding in to help with infrastructure and everything else. I have real concerns about this going through too quickly, and we haven't had an answer to that letter that the combined mayor sent about pausing it. But I think we need to sort of re-edify our approach on slowing things down, because if this comes out wrong in the end, there's going to be pretty big consequences down the line for generations, and we need to get this right.
Yep, we can certainly ask it. I think Councillor Owen was next.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to raise again that importance of affordability and unintended consequences of effectively reducing rates but adding another cost on, and those who are on rates who have where they get some of the rates funding back through central government agencies and stuff like that, that there's cross communication for implementation across all those government departments to make sure that there's nobody who really misses out, because I think there's a real risk that some people who gets rates remission at the moment might find themselves short quite a bit. So.
Yep, I get that. Very good. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. Yeah, just following on from Councillor Keister, I think we should be not backwards about coming forwards with composting human manure. How come we can't say it? Let's just say it so that we can talk about it and get it part of the conversation. And then on from Councillor Scott, he's saying slow things down. Well, that's good, but at what point do we come to this where we say a yes or no? I would like to know when do we say no? Because I'm saying no, but
yeah, we don't know until we know every situation that's occurring, Councillor.
We will never know every situation. Every question that's been popped up today, there is no answer to it.
Well, I hope we have some guidance as of the 30th of September from government. Okay, are there any other comments around that? Matt, I'd like to thank you for summarising that. It certainly fits in very well with all the notes that I've taken. It is a very big amendment to make, or addition, I should say, not amendment, to make to our Three Waters discussion and the resolutions that we need to tick off today. So I'm going to adjourn that item, 7.1, until Matt's had an opportunity to put things in black and white. And that may or may not be today.
Through you, Your Worship. I imagine I could get something on paper by 2 o'clock this afternoon, but I'm not sure we would achieve the feedback from the various parties that's likely to want to be undertaken through that process.
So I'm just realising and understanding the importance of this discussion and maybe adjourn it to an urgent.
Well, the other option is that we adjourn, once we've got the other business on the agenda, we adjourn the meeting to the date.
Yeah. Well, just adjourn. Yeah, so we'll go through the other business on the agenda today, and at the conclusion of the day, we'll adjourn this meeting to a date we get to forward, because this is important. It's important material that's got to go north, but it's more important that we get it right. So I'll be asking that it go to all councillors as soon as Matt has been able to amend L of this resolution, and we'll discuss it at a open meeting in the very near future. I just don't want to put too much pressure on Mr. Russell today to get this done, because there is a hell of a lot of comments that have been picked up, and we need, as I say, need to get it right. Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank you, Dan, for your input into this item. I'd certainly clarified some matters very, very well, and I'd like to thank all councillors for their contributions today. But more importantly, I'd like to thank those out in our communities who have been patient. We have been working in the background with this, and you've heard from Dan and Matt that that there's a hell of a lot of information has come forward, and I appreciate the time and effort of everyone in negotiating, finding their way through that information. And as I say, thank you for the patience of those in our communities. But rest assured that we are taking this matter seriously. It's one of the bigger decisions for any council, and we are bound by legislation over what we can and can't do on your behalf. So yeah, just please be aware that we will bring this matter to an open discussion in the very, very near future. But in the meantime, we're going to carry on with the rest of the meeting business. So the next item on the agenda is
Carry on.
next item on the agenda is the road realignment at Curio Bay, item 8.1 on your agenda, for which Councillor Duffy has declared an interest. It's not in confidential, so he can remain online, but cannot comment or if there is a vote on it. So have we got Mr. McNaught online somewhere to?
Can you hear me, Your Worship?
Yep, got you there, Mr. McNaught. So if you can speak to item 8.1, please.
Thank you. I'll take the report as read, and it possibly looks more complex than it is, but it's really just tidying up all the legal aspects of the developments that that have happened at Curio Bay over the last few years. And if you look at the differences between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 to the report, you'll see the wastewater treatment plant, the deviation of Mere Road, the new car park, the new Tumatoka Curioscape building. And for all that to happen, we need to change the land status and the boundaries, particularly around road stoppings for through the car park, the new alignment of Mere Road to legally align that with the physical. Look at changing the status for Section 7 to a wastewater treatment site as part of the district activity that's yet to be completed, but I'm attempting to do all this in one report. But in saying that, possibly the biggest contention item is the stopping of the road around the headland. We all believe it's the right thing to do. We are proposing that we do all this, or request the Minister of Land Information to undertake all this activity under the Public Works Act. However, if they don't agree, we will have to do the road stoppings. The road stoppings around the car park, I'm pretty sure we'll get through. The other ones, we will ask them as part of the process. If they don't, then we would have to go through the Local Government Act process to stop the roads, which is public objections, et cetera, et cetera. But as I've said in the report, we've had previous approval from DOC for the land around the headland. They consulted the Conservation Board at the time, they consulted iwi at the time, and they supported the transaction happening. So without saying any more, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McNaught. Certainly clear to me. Is there any comments or questions around this matter? There being no comments or questions from Councillor Keast.
Can I
Sorry.
speak, Kerry?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this tidying this all up at once and the removal of the road reserve that edges the headland is a good idea. It doesn't stop access to the place. It enhances the fact that it's all then considered one type of land use, and so it makes management of it that much easier. And the other matters are really just the logic of removing road or putting in the road, what's road reserve, on aligning it with the road and taking it out of the car park and etc., and also giving the wastewater its due allocation. So I think that it's a good move and good work to get it done all at once.
So am I hearing that you're happy to move the recommendation, Councillor Keast?
Yes, I am, subject to the support of everybody else.
Thank you. So Councillor Keast has moved it. Are there any other comments or questions from anyone? Seconder?
If I may, just your worship, just for clarification for councillors, the reason the two survey plans were done was the first one, ISO 532228, section 4 went right to the coast. Unfortunately, that was an error that never got picked up until the plan was approved. The reason we had to do the second plan was to split it into section 1 and section 2, because section 2 on the second plan is the bit that first of all becomes a Esplanade Reserve. It wasn't separated on the original plan. So section 1 on the second plan can just have the road status removed. Section 2 on that plan, because it fronts the coast, will firstly become an Esplanade Reserve. So that's why we had to do both of them.
Okay, thank you for that. So it's moved Councillor Keast, seconded by Councillor Ford. Before I put it, is there any other comments or questions in regards to this matter? If not, all those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you for your work on that one, Mr. McNaught. So the second item is yours again. It's item 8.2, which is the Hedgehoe Golf Club. I did ask a question in regards to that the other day, and thank you for your response to that matter, Mr. McNaught. So please speak to this one.
Excuse me. Yes, Your Worship. This lease at the golf course has been operating under the old regime that the organisation operated under with council and the local reserve committees, which are not committees, they're just local ad hoc groups that come through from the old Reserves and Domains Act into the Reserves Act. But what was happening was the building that's the golf club or the golf club rooms is owned by council, and when the lease was put in place some years ago, the golf club was responsible for the inside of the building, the council the outside. The rental that was being paid by the golf club was covering a bit of maintenance money, the insurance costs that council was accruing because it was its building. And then when we come to the situation of the outside having to be repainted at council's cost, the funds held by the reserve group was not sufficient to cover that liability at council. So we discussed it with the Aridi Community Board and with the locals and the golf club, and we believe the best outcome is to transfer the ownership of the building to the golf club and put a new lease in place, give them a grant towards the painting of the outside of the building, which allows them to then reduce the rental they pay to council because it will be their building. They'll have to maintain it. They'll have to insure it. They can then access funds for grants for that they can't access at the moment because it's a council building. So, yeah, we just believe that this is the best long-term outcome. The community board are happy to make the unbudgeted expenditure or have decided to make the unbudgeted expenditure of $3,000, and that's primarily the cost of the paint because the golf club will do the physical works themselves, and Councillor Radenclaw might wish to comment on that in a moment, but to fund it out of the Winton Ward Reserve, it requires the approval of council. The second thing that requires the approval of council is the transfer of the building to the golf club. And if those two decisions are made, then it's conditional upon the payment not being made until the building transfer agreement and the new lease has been agreed with the golf club. So the only other issue was what His Worship the Mayor raised with me in regard to the current lease around the ownership of the trees. That was put in place specifically when the current lease was put in place, for the reason that if anything happened to the golf club and the lease fell over, it was clear that the trees belonged to the council as the landowner, and the golf club just couldn't clear fell them and then walk away. Even though the golf club are and will be responsible for all the maintenance, including the trees, it just clarifies that the ownership of all the trees, whether plantation or planted, belong to council. Now, that may be subject to further discussions as part of the new lease, but that is why that's in the existing lease.
Thank you for that. Thanks for your time on that one. Councillor Radenclaw.
Through you, Your Worship. Thank you, Kevin, for your report and for all your time on this. It's a great outcome for the community and the community board. It'll ensure the survival of the Hedgehope Club, specifically around funding. The painting, truly endorse that we pay for the paint. The club are going to paint it themselves, and there's also an offer for anyone wanting to go out with a paintbrush one day in the summer, that you'd be very welcome at the Hedgehope Golf Club. They're a great community and a driven club, and I'd like to move that we go forward with Kevin's report today.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So it's moved by Councillor Radenclaw. Is there a seconder? Councillor Fraser. Before I put it, is there any other comments or questions? Okay, all those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you for your time on that one and sorting that one out too, Mr. McLaughlin. Right, next item on the agenda is item 8.3, page 309 of your agenda, which is the carry forward request for 2021 into 21-22. And Ms. Robson's online to discuss that, to comment on that one. Thank you, Anne.
Good morning, councillors, Your Worship. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Kate would have been here, but she's had to just pop away and pick up her son. So I'm just presenting the report that you will remember that you receive on an annual basis. And this report basically is just requesting council approve the carry forward of monies that were collected for projects and operating costs from the 2021 financial year into the 21-22 financial year. This report is not proposing any increases to the costs that have already been budgeted, nor is it proposing any changes to funding sources. All it is doing is just moving those costs that have not yet been expensed and are still required into the future years, and it's seeking approval in regards to that. So attachment A, which is on page 317, just outlines that expenditure that those requests are being made for and the reasons why. In total, there's 106 items coming to around $4 million. You will remember, of course, that in our forecasting process in February, we do also anticipate at that stage a number of costs that we may not incur and which may need to be moved. And if we do identify those, we have incorporated those already into the first year of the LTP. This process here takes that into account. So there's no double dipping of it by such. We do look to make sure that those costs aren't already in the LTP when we're requesting this going forward. And you will, of course, note in the resolutions there's a number of negative items. That's where we've actually spent more in the year to the 30th of June 21 than we had anticipated. So we're pulling some of the money back from the LTP first year. I suppose the key items in there as it currently stands right now, you'll see there's resolutions in regards to income. The main item in there is the Te Anau wastewater income that we're still going to receive around $1 million. OPEX expenses, the biggest costs in there are the Milford Opportunities project and just the timing of those works. Of course, that's fully funded from grants, 329. There's some community leadership projects that are on the go that we'd like to carry forward the consultants budget for, and some emergency works. And the operating projects line, there's some Luxmore costs, there's about 152. And in the CapEx side of the 3.9 million, by far the biggest is, of course, the stimulus project and the timing of those, which is around 1.3, and then a number of other projects as you'll see. So I think I'll leave it at that and then just ask for any questions.
Thank you for that. Certainly a big list there and well explained. Thank you. Okay, any comments or questions from anyone in regards to this item? Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm happy with what's been proposed, but just a clarifying question around the replacement of books lost to mould at the Winton Library. Were we able to claim insurance on the replacement of those books?
Councillor Menzies, no, we unfortunately weren't able to claim insurance on those items because it had been the mould from memory had been occurring over a long period of time, therefore the insurance didn't cover it.
Okay, thank you. And we didn't actually pick up any mould, obviously, on any of the books for some time.
Through you, I'm not actually sure on that side of it. I don't know whether the mould occurred at that stage or whether it was just when they shut down the air conditioning, whether actually a lot of it happened at that point.
Thank you.
Okay, I can't see any other hands up. Can you, Fiona?
No.
Okay, I can't see any other hands up in regards to this matter. So you have the recommendations in front of you, and for this item, is there a councillor can move the recommendations? Councillor Kramer, seconded Councillor Menzies. All those in favour? Yes, can you say yes or hands up? Against? Carried. Thank you for that, Anne. Next item on the agenda is item 8.4, the management report from our Chief Executive.
Right, thank you, Your Worship. Good morning, everybody. The management report, which I'm pleased to present, was put together over the most extreme time of lockdown. And I really want to acknowledge first and foremost the immediate response of your team, of your staff, and just how smoothly they swung into action. Actually, the IMT, the incident management team, met pretty much every day. They all met remotely. We did have a contingency plan in place just in case the comms went down, but actually, luckily, we didn't need it. But they generally met every day after there'd been the Prime Ministerial announcement and any adjustments that we needed to make to our operating conditions. The team then made following that, and then we relayed those out to the organisation. I do know there's been a bit more commentary in general media since about how New Zealand is responding to this particular lockdown and this latest incursion of the COVID virus, and that it is a different response than last time, and people are feeling it differently. The level of resilience that the community and our staff had going into this one was less than last time, and I really want to acknowledge that it is not the same when you're working from home under the constraints of COVID, and it's not the same as choosing to not work in the office. And while we're now much more familiar with the presence of little people randomly popping into Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, and the slightly distracted look that a number of people have when they are on Zoom, and they're also addressing some urgent domestic crisis that may be feline based or child based, but actually I just really want to acknowledge and thank our team for having stuck together and delivered so much that they have. That said, it isn't easy, and in fact this report is a little bit of the symptom of many hands working remotely and not just exactly effectively. There are a couple of items in the report which you will have noticed you already knew about because they'd already occurred in August. I apologise for that. There were some adjustments made, but they don't seem to have made it through to the final result. I just did want to touch on the fact that, and it's actually come up a couple of times already this morning on other matters, is that while this is all going on, the big issues for local government are still progressing in Wellington. And we were trying to get here a bit of an update on the RMA reform, because that is a very large issue. And that has been going through various exposure drafts and feedback, and obviously you're aware that council has actively participated and submitted. I'm also aware that the Future for Local Government review is meant to be sending its preliminary report to the government at the end of this month. So that's also been going on. We're not aware of whether it's on track or it's not, because there's no way of finding out. But the extensive conversation this morning around Three Waters is only part of a much wider context, and that is making it reasonably a challenging time. That said, government themselves obviously are affected by COVID, and my unofficial understanding is that a number of their select committees and other normal processes have also been affected, and we don't actually know now whether the timetable that they thought they were going to deliver some of the stuff through would still be able to be adhered to, or whether they might prioritise, and we might see some of these things play out in a slightly different timetable. Other than that, I think that's all from me.
Thank you for that, Mr. McIntosh. Questions, Councillor Kramer?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on page 332, with regards to policy and strategy, bylaws and policies that have been worked through. I know we had a session on Airbnb. Should we actually add that policy review on this list? Because I think it would be beneficial that we do add that onto that policy to be reviewed. Now's the time to be doing it. So I would move that or recommend that we add that to that bylaw and policy work list that's presented.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kramer. Chief Executive is noting that. Councillor Duffy.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just item 21 to do with property, where it's mention of the demands of community housing. Some of us delivered letters to the residents at the community housing a couple of weeks ago, advising them that the rent was going to go up, and that someone from council would, I think, be getting in touch with them before that went up in, I understand, early October. So I'm just wondering with COVID if that's still on track to happen, or do we need to notify them of a bit of a change in plan regarding the getting back to them?
Mr. Hamlin's just waving his hand if he could answer that.
Mr. Hamlin, sorry about that.
Through you, Worship. Good morning, everyone. Look, that's still on plan. We have, once those letters have been delivered, we've got statutory days that we've got to meet anyway. So staff will be working through that as they can. So I don't see any change to that at this stage.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you. Was there another hand up somewhere?
Mine.
Oh, Kramer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Worship. On page 329, building, I note that there's the current, an average of 74% of consent received by council require further information prior to being issued. Is this a trend going up, or is that a normal trend, or is that trend going down? Because that seems to be significantly high, that we're receiving those consent forms from either builders or architects, and yet the 74% of those consents received require further information. So it's quite a significant percentage. So is there a need to have additional education out there to make sure that the information that is provided to council, that it is all the information that is required? So I'm just asking whether that's a trend or it's going up or down. I may not have the answer here today, but maybe something worthwhile looking at.
Through you, Your Worship, whilst I'm not clear as to how it compares against other territorial authorities, I am aware that following engagement with our local industry, it is an issue that we've identified and been in communication with our industry around, and we're working with them to ensure clarity around exactly what's provided and what format to what standard is necessary to enable us to undertake our function as the consenting authority in line with our resource management responsibilities. So in fact, as recently as Thursday last week, I was reviewing some correspondence that would be shared with our local industry on that particular topic and some other related aspects. So it's something we're very aware of and certainly working towards resolving.
No, that's great, because it does take up a lot of staff time as well if you've got to keep asking for more information.
Correct.
So fully support what you're undertaking. So good to hear it's been looked at.
Thank you. Councillor Menzies, Councillor Owen.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, my question was in the same area and related to that. Was the inspection volumes remain high with a pass rate of 53%. So is that improving? Is it decreasing? Or where is it in terms of a trend, and what can be done in the way of education about that? So I guess it'll be the same response, Mr. Russell.
Thank you. Councillor Owen.
Thank you. My question isn't something specifically in the report, but I just thought I'd mention it now in case anyone is watching as well. It's just I saw through the council level 2 levels that the freedom camping sites are closed at the moment. And I just thought it would be important to get a message out, perhaps through social media or something, letting people know, because if the weather's anything like it is today, this weekend, people will be packing up and heading to some of those sites, and I'd hate for them to be disappointed when they got there and found that there's no toilets open. So yeah, if there's any way that we can do some comms around that, I'm sure people will be disappointed that the sites are closed, but rather they moan about it on social media than be really upset and frustrated when they get there with their families. So yeah.
Thank you. Noted. Okay, no other questions in regards to this item. I'm happy to move the report, the agenda. Councillor Keast, all those in favour? Against?
Aye.
Carried. And just to reiterate the Chief Executive's comment, certainly thank you very much to everyone involved, and it's going to be in lockdown level 2 for a wee bit longer yet, so let's just keep patient again, but thank you all very, very much. Okay, just before we move into public excluded, I'd just like to advise you that a discussion has occurred in regards to the further discussion of the item around Three Waters, and the date for that will be on Monday, the 27th of September, 2021 at 9 a.m, which is the meeting for finance and assurance. So we will open the finance and assurance meeting, adjourn it, then I will open the council meeting, which obviously will probably more likely to be in Zoom, because it for those that aren't on that committee, I just can't see the need for you all to travel in for a short discussion. So it will be open, and then we will discuss the Three Waters situation and then move into the finance and assurance. So that's Monday, the 27th of September at 9 a.m. If we can just put that into your diaries, that there will be an invite for a Zoom meeting for the for that council meeting to reconvene, and then I don't know what's going to happen with finance and insurance. We'll have to wait and see where we're at with COVID at that stage. All right, so the next item on the agenda is in public excluded. So I'm going to move that we go into public excluded for the reasons contained in the agenda, and mainly around that the public conduct of the whole of the relevant part of these proceedings of the meeting would be likely to result in the disclosure of information for which good reason which there is good reason for withholding, exists. So we're going to go into public excluded as per section 7.2H of to discuss the insurance and project management of the internal audit, which is unbudgeted expenditure. So we'll just wait for those who, is there a seconder? Councillor Kramer, all those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. So we'll just wait for those that don't need to be on